CBSE Board, Class 9, History, Chapter 1, Part 9, audio by Renee Matthew. So we saw that people supporting Robespierre were also demanding moderation from him because he was an extreme leader. But he was not ready for it, and because of that, as a result of which, he was also convicted in court, and he also finally ended up in the guillotine. What is liberty? Two conflicting views. Can you see a person on the screen? His name is Camille Desmoulins. He was a revolutionary journalist who openly wrote about his views. And let's see what is liberty according to him. He was executed shortly after during the Reign of Terror. Whose period or whose reign was known as Reign of Terror? Robespierre. Some people believe that liberty is like a child. So before children reach maturity, there is a lot of taming that we have to do, right? Taming is done for wild animals. But children will have to be tuned. They will have to be molded before they reach their maturity, where they are disciplined. Just like that, liberty is a child. It is like a child which needs to go through a phase of being disciplined before it attains maturity. So we will have to keep on giving it a lot of molding before it reaches maturity. Quite the opposite. Liberty is happiness, reason, equality, justice. It is the declaration of rights. So liberty is not a simple thing or a simple concept as freedom. It is a combination of all these things. That is happiness, reason, equality, justice, which is known as the declaration of rights. You would like to finish off all your enemies by guillotining them. Has anyone heard of something more senseless? So he feels that guillotine is a senseless action, because when somebody opposes you, suddenly go and behead the person. No, that is not the right way according to Camille Desmoulins. Would it be possible to bring a single person to the scaffold without making 10 more enemies among his relations and friends? So when guillotine is executed, when this kind of system is executed, more enemies will come. He is asking if there is any other alternative where a single person, without scaffolding, without putting down a single person, without hampering the relation between friends and people, without making enemies, are there any ways towards liberty? So he was a revolutionary journalist, and that is why he openly wrote about it. On 7th February 1794, Robespierre made a speech at the convention. I told you that convention was a new form of constitution, and Robespierre made a speech there, which was then carried by the newspaper Le Moniteur Universel. Here is an extract from it. So this is something which was written by Robespierre in 1794 in a newspaper. Let's read it together. To establish and consolidate democracy. So that was his principle, to establish democracy, to establish a constitution. But the only thing is, he used the wrong method. He used the wrong technique to establish democracy. To achieve the peaceful rule of constitutional laws, we must first finish the war of liberty against tyranny. So there was a big Cold War, an open revolt also, on the other hand, which was going on between liberty and tyranny. People wanted freedom. I told you that freedom was a combination of so many things. So there was a big war between liberty and tyranny, and we have to put an end to that. That is what Robespierre demanded. We must annihilate the enemies of the Republic. That is, we should put a stop to the enemies of the Republic at home and abroad. You should remember that France was influencing many parts of the world, and there were so many people around, inside and around, who were anticipating the freedom of France. And at the same time, there were a lot of enemies inside, within the nation. Right? There will be so many people who were against the revolutionary ideas put forward by these reformers. Similarly, there was a lot of enemies abroad also. Or else we will perish. If we don't annihilate, if we don't just axe the enemies which is within the Republic of France and abroad, it is going to be very difficult. We will not be able to put forward and establish democracy. In time of revolution, a democratic government may rely on terror. So during this fight for democracy, it is okay to rely on terror. That is what Robespierre told, and that is what he did also. Terror is nothing but justice, swift, severe, and inflexible. So it is justice, fighting for justice, something which is very fast, something which is extreme, and something which is not bendable, inflexible, and is used to meet the most urgent needs of the fatherland. So he feels that terror will have to be used for a small period of time to establish democracy. To curb the enemies of liberty through terror is the right of the founder of the republic. So he feels that it was the right of the founder of the republic himself to just put an end to the enemies of liberty, and that is what he did. If anybody even dared to disagree with him, what he will do? He will just send them to guillotine. Alright, so that is something which was told by Robespierre himself. Now what is this? A directory rules France. So we know that the Jacobin government just fell apart after the death of Robespierre. The fall of the Jacobin government allowed the wealthier middle class to seize power. So, in an audio which began with this chapter, we saw that the society was divided into 3 estates, and the third estate comprised of 90% of the population. Third estate was very huge, and we had lot of people inside that estate, which comprised of professionals and also the beggars, the servants, the artisans, women, everybody who was at a lower strata of the society. So Jacobin club comprised of the normal artisans, the normal servants, the beggars, the people who got very less wages. All these people comprised of the Jacobin club. Alright? Now there was another part to the estate. There was another part to the third estate. Who were they? They were the wealthier middle class. So when one half of the third estate just fell down, that is the Jacobin government, the wealthier middle class was so happy and they seized power. They were waiting for it. The new constitution was introduced which denied the vote to non-propertied sections of society. So do you remember that men above the age of 25 were given rights to vote initially by the foreign general estate, the general group of assembly? Then the National Assembly allowed men of age 21 and upward to cast their vote, right? That was a new rule. Now, what this particular new constitution said was, people who did not have a property weren't allowed to cast their vote. It provided for 2 elected legislative councils. So this particular group, that is the directory, okay, this constitution, the new constitution is known as a directory. They had 2 legislative councils. These then appointed a directory. So after 2 councils will be there, then there will be another body known as a directory. The directory comprised of an executive made up of 5 members. They were like the representatives. So 5 members will be there inside the directory. This was meant as a safeguard against the concentration of power in a one-man executive as under the Jacobins. So earlier also I told you that people were against one-man rule. People did not want one person to completely control the nation, like how Louis XVI did, and that is which led to a lot of problems. So now people really wanted to be a part of the government. So because of that, these 5 members were the representatives, and they did not want to concentrate power on one particular person. Next point. However, the directors often clashed with the legislative councils, who then sought to dismiss them. So you should remember that the legislative council were 2 in number, and then came the directors. What happened? They both fought, and then the legislative council dismissed the directory, which comprised of 5 members. The political instability of the directory paved the way for the rise of a military dictator. So now the present government did not have any unity. You can see that anywhere, even in a small institution. When there is no unity, when there is a chance for them to stumble and fall, new people will come in. So now who was the new person? Just now the people got rid of one person. Who is it? Robespierre, who was so famous for terror. Now another military dictator is coming worse than that, Napoleon Bonaparte. Famous person in the world history, not only in the history of France. He made his impact everywhere in the world, the way he disciplined this particular nation. So let's see what he did. Through all these changes in the form of government, the ideals of freedom, of equality before the law, and of fraternity remained inspiring ideals that motivated political movements in France and rest of Europe during the following centuries. So now, we saw that so much of revolt and uprising took place in France from the beginning. Did you notice that from the beginning of the chapter? Where people took courage and openly revolted against such a strong king. Right? They took the courage. I told you that reformation and revolution is always required a lot of courage to go against the ordinary track and fight against them. So you can see that French people were so courageous and they gained the strength to stand together and fight against injustice. So that was something which inspired the rest of the world, even the rest of the European continent. So everybody was looking up to France, especially on three ideals. What were they? Fraternity, liberty, and equality. These three principles emerged from French Revolution, and this is something which was looked up to by the rest of the world. Did women have a revolution? We saw that in many places women weren't granted much freedom. They were not allowed to cast their vote. They had to stay at home and just look after the family and earn a living. So all these things might have created attention, but oh yeah, they actually stayed back and they discussed on the newspapers and books that were coming up, and they also participated in the club, but they were not active members of the revolution. They were just involved passively. From the very beginning, women were active participants in the events which brought about so many important changes in French society. So what they're trying to tell here is, when they stormed into Bastille, do you remember in the beginning of the chapter, a mob, 7,000 men and women stormed into Bastille, and they just hit all the stones, and they started selling the remains of stones in the market. Do you remember that? From that time itself, women were actively involved. But after that, what happened? They hoped that their involvement would pressurize the revolutionary government to introduce measures to improve their lives. So they fought for them also. It is not just for men. What happened gradually? Men got more power, and they were just passive listeners or passive participants. So though they were working like the men, they never got their lives improved. They never got their rights. That is what is the meaning of the sentence. So let's look at all these points. The first point, most women of the third estate had to work for a living. So everybody worked for a living just like the men. They worked as seamstresses or laundresses, sold flowers, fruits and vegetables at the market. So all small jobs which was really important in the society, like taking clothes for washing, sewing, stitching, selling flowers, fruits, vegetables, all these things were part of the daily necessity. That is what they did. Or were employed as domestic servants in the houses of prosperous people. So they used to go and work in the household of nobles, kings, and other prosperous people, especially business people. Most women did not have access to education or job training. Only daughters of nobles or wealthier members of the third estate could study at a convent. So wherever they studied, where women studied, that particular place was known as the convent. After which their families arranged a marriage for them. So only wealthy people got access to education. This was not the state of women. Even of men, it was like that. Others had to just work hard. Working women had also to care for their families, that is, cook, fetch water, queue up for bread, and look after the children. So all these things were done. So we saw that when women stayed in a queue for a longer time in front of the bakery, they really got impatient and stormed into the bakeries. So they were expected to do all these things. Okay, small activities, but it is very important for your life. their wages were lower than those of men. So that is something which is unfair. The wage was very low compared to that of men, and that is something which must have disturbed them. Fifth point, in order to discuss and voice their interest, women started their own political clubs and newspapers. I told you that they already were engaged in political clubs and newspapers. They started writing also. About 60 women's clubs came up in different French cities. So now 60 women's clubs were formed. So after all these daily activities, they got time. They actually kept apart some time to go and discuss in the clubs. The Society of Revolutionary and Republican Women was the most famous of them. So we saw that among the men, it was Jacobean Club which emerged. Now among the women, it was Republican Women and Society of Revolutionary. So what was their main demand? What did they want? One of their main demands was that women enjoy the same political rights as men. Why? Because they fought with the men from the beginning and they were not doing anything. The government or the constitution was not doing anything to improve the standard of women's life. So they wanted equal partnership in the political life of the nation. Women were disappointed that the Constitution of 1791 reduced them to passive citizens. This point is repeated again and again. I also told you earlier that they were passive citizens. They demanded the right to vote. So do you remember, they were not given any access, they were not given any right to vote, to cast their vote, to be elected to the assembly and to hold political office. That is, they also wanted to represent themselves in the government where they can also become representatives. Only then they felt would their interests be represented in the new government. So nobody will be there to speak for them if there is no woman representative. In the early years, the revolutionary government did introduce laws that helped improve the lives of women. So in the early years, of course, the government said, okay, we will do something for you, and imposed laws which helped to raise the standard of living of women. That was in the early years, not later. Together with the creation of state schools, schooling was made compulsory for all girls, not only people belonging to the noble family and wealthier family, but girls from all the families were asked to attend school, mandatory. Okay, their fathers could no longer force them into marriage against their will. So earlier it was like they'll be sent to convent, only people from the noble and richer families, they'll be sent to convent, and then their family will arrange their marriage, and then sometimes they will have to marry against their will. So you should remember that this particular period has created lot of tremor in all the branches of the world, that is sociology, literature, political science, everywhere. You can see the mention of the French Revolution at least once everywhere. So this is something which triggered the people to go forward, especially women. Marriage was made into a contract, entered into freely and registered under civil law. Till then it was not registered. Till then it was not entered freely against the will. So it was against the will of the women that they were asked to get married. The fathers will decide and they will get them married. So now it was made very compulsory that it was like a contract where two people agreed to live together, come together in companionship. And it was entered into freely and registered under the civil law in France only after the revolutionary government came up. Divorce was made legal. Okay, it was not legalized till then and could be applied for by both women and men. Earlier, maybe the men were just allowed to stay away from the family and run away from the family according to their will, but now divorce was made legal and it could be applied from both the sides, by the women and by the men also. And you should remember that marriage was a contract and it entered freely and registered under the civil law.